The purpose of this video is to give a basic introduction of tissues found in the cardiovascular system. Understanding these will help you understand how the cardiovascular system functions and certain disease processes that can affect the cardiovascular system. Now, one of the big things that I tell people is if you can understand the basic roots, you can actually understand a lot of the other aspects. So for instance, in regular skeletal muscle, we talked about myo meaning muscle. Cardio means heart, so myocardium would be muscle heart. Peri means around, so a pericardium would be around the heart. Striated, just like in striated skeletal muscle, means striped. And we talked a little bit at the beginning about what squamous means, as it means flat. And so you do have tissue that's squamous epithelium. You do have simple squamous epithelium in the technically endothelium in the cardiovascular system. Adipose also tells you a lot about what's happening. So adipose tissue is fat tissue. So anytime you see adipose, it's a tissue revolving around fat tissue. So adipocyte would be a fat cell, site being cell. Now, the layers of the heart, we actually have different layers. The innermost layer would be the endocardium. Endo means inside, cardium, heart, so endocardium is the inside layer. We also have the myocardium, which is the heart muscle, and we have something called the pericardium, which peri means around the heart. It's a sac around the heart, which has two layers, which we'll talk about later. Now, we do have myocardium, and the cells that make up the myocardium are the myocardiocytes. Again, myo means muscle, cardio heart, cyte cell. And so this is the heart muscle tissue of the heart. And the muscle tissue is striated, so you can't see lines here coming down. And it also has this thing called intercalated discs, which are a visible presentation of what's called desmosomes, which are special proteins that latch into the cell next to it, and gap junctions, which allow the cells to communicate. Now, these big flat things you see here will be the nuclei, and the myofibrils will be making the sarcomeres here. Like I said, the structure within the intercalated disc, you have the desmosomes, which interlock the cells, and then you have the gap junctions, which form a connection between neighboring cells. This allows the myocardiocytes to function as a unit. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the layers of the heart, and you have an inner lining, which is called the endocardium, which is made out of simple squamous endothelium, technically in this case, and there is a small layer of areolar tissue between that. Usually, you end up throwing that loose, irregular connective tissue, called areolar tissue, between two different tissues. Myocardium means muscle, and so the area here that you can see in this cutout heart would be the myocardium, the heart layer, and you have the pericardium, which is a sac around it. Now you have a visceral and parietal. Usually the parietal will be the top layer, visceral will touch the organ. So as you have two layers, the visceral would actually be touching the myocardium, which is technically something called the epicardium as well. It does touch the organ, and it does have the it does have the loose irregular connective tissue, and there's a cavity within it which has fluid, which when you hear someone having pericardial effusion, it means that the area between the pericardium has fluid. And so we do have the loose irregular connective tissue. You can see these fibers here, collagen fibers and elastic fibers are coiled here, and this is pretty much the loose irregular. You can notice that the fibers run everywhere, and these dots here are usually going to be fibroblasts. Occasionally you can find some macrophages in there, but usually this is the loose irregular, and it is found between the myocardium and the endothelium of the heart, and also between the myocardium and the epicardium. So you have simple squamous endothelium. Again, these are flat cells with a basement membrane holding the cells in place. Simple will tell you only have one cell layer. So when we look at it, you would actually have one cell layer. You do have a serous membrane, which is a pericardium. It is a sac It has 3 layers made with the visceral layer that touches the organ. Parietal layer is the outer, and then you have the cavity within it. The visceral layer does have areolar tissue, and it does have the simple squamous mesothelium in this case. Parietal layer is simple squamous mesothelium and dense irregular connective tissue. Now, this actually will give you some clinical things later on. Now, one of the things that happens is the heart requires a lot of energy, and so it has a lot of mitochondria. In general cell biology, you have learned that mitochondria need oxygen to be able to run uh, its production of energy. So as mitochondria require a lot of oxygen, the heart, the myocardiocytes require a lot of oxygen. And for energy, they tend to use a lot of fat for energy. So the heart has adipose tissue surrounding it, so it can have the energy stores it needs to maintain life. Now, I drew here what an adipocyte would look like. You would actually have a huge cell nucleus pushed to the end, and most of these wouldn't stain. You'd have a clear area, and you might see the cell membrane around there, but they do have a nucleus squeezed to the ends. And so this is actually roughly what adipose tissue would look like. You will be expected to look at it in lab. Now, besides the heart, you also have other specialized structures. I can tell you that this here is an artery, and this one here is a vein. You do have a nerve here, which we'll talk about later. The reason that you can tell this is if you look at the muscle wall of this artery, and you look at the muscle wall of this vein here, the muscle wall of the arteries tend to be a bit larger. If you look at the lumen, the area inside, the lumen of the artery tends to be smaller than the lumen of the vein. And so a lot of times arteries will maintain their structure. The veins usually not. Now I mentioned adipose tissue, and you can see here that thin area, that almost clear area. This is where you could find adipose tissue. You do have dense irregular connective tissue. You also have a smooth muscle here. It's a different type of different tissue. In the arteries, you also have elastic tissue, which causes it to pull, constrict, and so the simple inside this, you have simple squamous endothelium, and it's pulled, giving you this bumpy appearance. The veins will have simple squamous endothelium as well, but it won't be pulled. It does have elastic tissues, but not as much as the arteries. So arteries have a larger muscle layer, veins have a larger lumen. You do have different names, which are called tunicas. Tunica intima, intimate meaning innermost. So that's usually made of simple squamous endothelium. You will have some areolar tissue underneath it. Then you have your tunica media, which is the muscle layer, tunica muscularis a lot of times. And the tunica adventitia would be the outer layer of connective tissue. Over here you can see the smooth muscle, tunica muscularis. It's smooth and it contracts as a unit. You can actually see the effects of the elastic tissue here. You can see causing it to wrinkle. The simple squamous endothelium to wrinkle a bit. Now large arteries will have a large amount of elastic tissue, and what you'll see is you'll see these coiled-like structures. These are elastins which allow the elastic fiber to return to its original shape. So there are tissues that you need to know to understand the cardiovascular system. You do need to understand the simple squamous endothelium. Simple meaning one, squamous flat, endothelium, endo meaning inside lining. The areolar tissue is dense irregular connective tissue, which I showed you that earlier. The areolar is loose irregular connective tissue. The dense irregular connective tissue is in the tunica adventitia. I mentioned about the striated, which means striped, cardiac, heart muscle, which is branched and has intercalated discs. Always look for the intercalated discs in the striated cardiac muscle. You do have smooth muscle, which will not have any striations. And you do have adipose tissue, which you'll have the nucleus pushed to the side, and you won't see much other than the cell membrane a lot of times. And you do have elastic tissue, which I've mentioned before. So over here, I wanted to just go through, and you can see the elastic fibers here. So this would be elastic tissue here.